Let's talk for a few minutes about ultraviolet light. So ultraviolet light or UV light is a type of light that's actually pretty similar to visible light, but it actually has different wavelengths, and that makes it invisible to our human eyes. And it's been known for more than 100 years, in fact, that some wavelengths of UV light are incredibly efficient at killing viruses and bacteria also. So actually, germicidal UV light is pretty commonly used these days to disinfect locations like hospital operating rooms. But the problem we've always had is that if people are directly exposed to this conventional germicidal UV light, there are potential hazards to our eyes and to our skin, and that really greatly limits how and when we can use it. So what we'd really love is a type of UV light which both kills viruses but is also safe. And about 7 or 8 years ago, we realized actually there was such a type of UV light, and that's far UVC light, which has an even shorter wavelength, around 220 nanometers. So what we know is that far UVC light efficiently kills viruses and bacteria too. But all the available evidence, and here's the thing, is that it's safe for human exposure. So if that's true, if far UVC light really is safe and it really does kill coronaviruses, then we have a window of opportunity. Overhead indoor far UVC lights could be used to kill viruses in indoor spaces where people are present, and so reduce the risk of person-to-person transmission of COVID-19. And as we start to reopen after the COVID-19 crisis slowly winds down, we hope, there are going to be so many situations where people are moving closer together in indoor spaces. Hospitals, of course, nursing homes, buses, planes, trains, train stations, schools, restaurants, offices, shops, theaters, gyms. The list can go on forever, in fact. So the two questions we need to think about are, first of all, is far UVC light safe? And does it really kill coronaviruses? So why is it safe? Well, it's safe because far UVC light really can't penetrate into any living cells in our body. It can't penetrate into our skin, can't penetrate into our eyes. And that's purely physics, and I'm a physicist by training, so it's nice to see something that's really physics-based. But that's the conceptual reason. But over the past 5 or 6 years, we and many other groups around the world have done a lot of studies to see, is it really safe? Studies on human skin, on mouse eyes, in many different situations and many different countries, and all seems to point to yes, it really is safe. But more than that, actually, there's a regulatory framework in existence right now. I mean, there are limits as to how much UV light at any given wavelength we can be exposed to. So the key, of course, is to stay within those regulatory limits. And then the other part of the story is, well, does it really kill coronaviruses? And the answer is, for sure it does. As you know, there are many human coronaviruses, and we're steadily working our way through them and checking, does it kill this coronavirus? Does it kill this coronavirus? Moving up to the SARS-CoV-2 virus. And what we can say today is that, yes, it's very efficient at killing coronaviruses. So if far UVC light is really safe and it really can kill coronaviruses in occupied indoor spaces, and I think it really does have the potential to be a powerful tool in our battle against COVID-19. And I might add, not just that, against influenza and against the next pandemic virus, if and when it comes. And in this sense, it's a little bit different from a vaccine, which is very specific to one particular strain of virus. So it sounds pretty positive, but that's not to say we should stop using the weapons we already have. We certainly shouldn't stop using masks. We certainly shouldn't stop practicing social distancing. But we do, I think, now have a new and potentially powerful weapon in our fight against this terrible virus.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that. It does sound like it could be a real game changer, if I can use that cliche.
It has that potential, yeah.
So, walk us through exactly how this far UVC light can kill a virus, but not harm, human skin cells or eye cells or whatever else.
Well, the reason is basically it's a physics reason, as I was saying, that far UVC light really can't travel very far in any sort of biological material. So right on the surface of our skin, for example, is a layer of dead cells. Um, and this far UVC light simply can't penetrate through those dead cells and so reach the living cells in the skin, in the epidermis and the dermis. And the same goes for the eye. On the very surface of our eye, there's some liquid called the tear layer. And far UVC light can't penetrate that either. So it can't reach the living cells in the eye, in the cornea, or deeper down in the lens, for example. So there's a real good physics reason why the far UVC light can't penetrate into living cells in our bodies. That said, bacteria and viruses are very much smaller entities. And so the far UVC light really does have enough range to penetrate them and kill them. So that's why it can kill viruses, but in principle is safe for human exposure.
So it's a kind of defense in depth because we have multiple cells kind of layered down. We're more defended against this particular wavelength than a virus or a bacteria would be.
That's right, and right on our surface of our skin and our eyes are non-living cells, so it doesn't matter if the far UVC is absorbed there, as long as it doesn't reach the living cells in our skin or in our eyes.
Now, the next question, which I think is true for all ultraviolet light, is that in our atmosphere anyway, it creates ozone, and that's a little bit of a human health hazard. Have you looked into that side of things at all? If there is kind of ozone creation when you have these lights on?
Yeah, for sure. But in fact, this far UVC light is not really at the wavelength that produces very much ozone. So we always measure and monitor the amount of ozone that's being produced. And it's absolutely minuscule. It's way below the EPA levels for ozone safety. So I don't think that's going to be an issue.
So fantastic. Safe for our skin, safe for our eyes, safe for our lungs. That's a pretty good trio. Let's see what the audience is curious about. We'll take that first question, please. How may far UVC light be used in settings limited by an easily accessible, stable source of electricity? So this is the power question.
Yeah, it's a good question, but and the bottom line is any indoor situation where you have regular visible lighting and you have power for that, the far UVC light is going to be applicable there. It doesn't have any special particular needs in terms of electricity. So as long as you, in your indoor setting, you have enough electricity to power regular lights, you'll be able to use far UVC lights. And sometimes some of the manufacturers are building in the far UVC light and the visible light into one fixture. Some manufacturers are having separate fixtures for the far UVC light and the visible light. But either way, there are really not any particular electrical limitations.
So wait a minute. Actually, visible light bulbs that also incorporate the far UVC wavelength to have a sterilizing effect.
Yeah, not in one bulb, but the idea from some manufacturers is to have a fixture, I should say, which has both a visible light in it and a far UVC light. Maybe one surrounds the other one. But it's a single fixture. And other manufacturers are thinking of, well, we'll have two separate fixtures, one for the visible lights that we already have and one for the far UVC lights. But always we're thinking about putting these far UVC lights essentially in the ceiling, in the same location as where we'd have the visible light. So as long as the visible light can light up the room, the far UVC light will be able to you expose the room in the same way.
Is there any limitation on distance, or however far the light can spread, the sterilization effect will occur?
Well, it just in the same way as when you have a room, you have to figure out, well, what sort of visible lighting am I going to have in this room? If it's a big room, you're going to have several lights. If it's a small room, you may only have one light. And that's the same thing for far UVC light. If we're talking about a big room, like in an airport, for example, or just a very large room, you're going to have a few far UVC lights overhead in the ceiling. And if it's a small room or an elevator, for example, you definitely only have to have one light. So the same story as for regular visible light.
Got it. Let's have that next audience question, please. Can UVC, far UVC, kill viruses fast enough to neutralize the virus particles borne on aerosols in the air?
Yeah, that's a really good question. That's a pretty central question. And we look upon it this way. So if you and I, David, are in a room together, and maybe with other people, and we're coughing and sneezing, some of us, so over time in that room, the level of aerosols and viruses in the air is going to start to build up. So what we really need is something that will continuously keep that level of virus down. So we'd like 99.99% killing in a few minutes, and that we can achieve. But the bottom line is to keep the level of virus in the air as low as possible. Because the lower the level of virus in the air, the less chance there is that it can be transmitted from one person to another. So it really is just keeping the level of virus long term in the air in that room as low as possible.
So that implies that these lights would kind of be always on, so that they're always having that sterilization effect. Is that indeed your thinking, that these far UVC lights would kind of always be on, even though we can't see them?
Well, they could be always on, or they could be on a significant fraction of the time. I don't think it would be very useful to have the lamps on at 8 o'clock in the morning for 5 minutes and then turn it off for the rest of the day, because the whole point is to keep killing the viruses as they're being produced, whereas people sneeze and cough and talk and shout. So we don't necessarily have to have it on every moment of the day, but we don't want to have it on just once a day. That's not the concept here.
Do you think does the sun, it must put out wavelengths, or it must put out light at this wavelength? Is that is there a possibility that the sun is providing some of the sterilization in an outdoor setting?
Yeah, well, no, actually it doesn't. There are three types of UV light. There's UVA and UVB and UVC, and they're just different. They're different wavelengths. UVC is the one that kills viruses and bacteria most efficiently. Now, the sun produces UVA and UVB and UVC, so they wing their way towards the Earth. But when they get to the atmosphere, the UVC is entirely absorbed in the upper atmosphere, actually in the ozone layer in the atmosphere. So down here on the ground, we don't feel any UVC at all. We only feel UVA, which is where we get some suntans from, and UVB. And those are not very efficient at killing viruses and bacteria. It's really UVC, which is the one which is very efficient at killing viruses. And that doesn't naturally occur here on the ground.
Gotcha. So we only get the sun burning in my case, UV. We don't get the good stuff.
Yeah, there's no doubt that UVA and UVB kill a little bit of bacteria and viruses, but not much. And anyway, we believe the whole story really is indoors. I mean, that's where most of the transmission from one person to another occurs. There may be some outdoors, but it's pretty limited compared to indoors. I think we're all concerned mainly about being in close proximity to one another indoors.
That's right. I mean, I think my top concern as a New Yorker is the subway, which is very indoors. They are using UV light, but it's this UVA or UVB light, right? And they can only use it when humans aren't present.
So in the New York MTA system, they are using conventional germicidal UV light, which is UVC. But as I said in my introductory words, that has the potential for health issues if it's directly exposed on people. So what the MTA are doing is at the moment the MTA is closed down between I think it's 1 a.m. and 5 a.m. something in the wee hours. So they're moving the conventional germicidal UV lights into the buses and into the trains, and essentially sterilizing the trains and buses overnight, which is a good thing. But come 5 a.m. in the morning, you have a nice clean subway car. But come 5:30 in the morning, when people start walking into that subway car, it's over the course of the day, it's going to become more and more contaminated. So while it's a good thing because you're starting from a clean train, by the end of the day, the effects have probably more or less gone away. So what we really want is something that can be used continuously or more or less continuously during the day when people are around. So to kill the bugs as they're being produced by people.
Sounds good to me. Let's take that next audience question, please. Is it practical to use the far UVC products that are on the market today, so the ones that are already out there, for our home or office environments or anywhere else?
Well, I must say that we haven't really addressed the issue of are these far UVC products really available? And the answer is somewhat. So there are several manufacturers and more are starting up pretty well day by day. But they really started ramping up production only as the COVID-19 crisis hit us, which is not that many months ago, if you could believe that. So that their capacity right now is relatively limited. So it would be fairly hard for someone who wants to install one of these things in their home to get hold of these lamps. I guess it's possible. But they are really ramping up production pretty rapidly. And so towards the end of the year, I think there will be really a lot of these far UVC products around.
So is this being, that would imply that maybe people are starting to implement this somewhere in the world? Is that the case?
Yeah, there are certainly test projects going on in a variety of different locations. And some here in New York City, I will say, and that's pretty exciting.
I would think that maybe your home institution, Columbia University, could find a use for them.
And that's indeed correct. And Columbia University is indeed looking very strongly at these things, and we hope to have those in place in the not too distant future.
And then that will give us more safety information, I imagine. So let's take that next audience question, please. Could a UVC light be added to a mask device that wouldn't need to filter them, just kind of kill the virus? I'm imagining this sort of like a headlamp, Ron.
Yeah, I'm not so sure that would be practical. And you need a power supply, for example, for the UV light. So it'd be a pretty bulky device. And really, we see this mostly as not a personal protective device, but as a social protective device. So a room full of people, that's where we'd like to have the lights in place so that we're just keeping the level of virus down as much as possible in that room, rather than as a PPE type device.
That brings to mind, if we put these everywhere, will viruses or bacteria begin to evolve to resist far UVC? I mean, they seem pretty canny at doing that relatively quickly.
Yeah, well, we don't think so because, I mean, as I said, UVC lights being has been used for decades now to sterilize different situations, different rooms, and there's no evidence for any UV resistant viruses emerging, and there's a good reason for that. It's a little bit different from a drug resistant bacteria emerging from when we use a drug, because the drugs very much focus on one particular aspect of the virus in order to kill it. UV is more like hitting the virus with the RNA in the virus with a sledgehammer. So you can't predict exactly where it's going to produce the damage within the RNA. So it will be very hard for a virus to evolve which is able to somehow repair RNA damage anywhere within its genome. It's a little different from a drug. So we certainly don't expect that, and there's no evidence that a canny virus has appeared in terms of UV sensitivity.
So an invisible blaster just blowing apart viral particles and bacteria wherever it may find them. Sounds very science fiction to me.
Well, I hope it's physics actually coming into real life, and I think that's guess what science fiction is. But it does seem practical, and I don't think it will necessarily be invisible. UV light, you're absolutely right, is invisible. But most of the manufacturers that I see are using the fact that the lamps actually produce a little bit of purple light at the same time. Now that purple light is not in any way killing the viruses, but I think it's showing people around that the lamp is on and giving people some sort of reassurance that they are being protected by the UV light. So I think most of the manufacturers are thinking we'll keep that low level of purple light in these lamps, so they won't be completely invisible.
That makes sense. It's a
think,
kind of
yeah,
the social engineering is as important as the physics engineering, right?
yes, for sure. If people don't accept the use of these things, it won't be very useful. But you know, we're all looking for different ways to protect ourselves in public spaces, and as we come closer and closer together. So certainly, talking to people, there's been a remarkable degree of excitement about the potential for far UVC light.
So take us back in your own personal journey with far UVC light. When did you first realize that this had this potential to combat all these troubling pathogens?
Well, we were originally thinking not about viruses but about bacteria, which are both nasty pathogens. Um, And my original motivation was that I had a friend who passed away from a drug-resistant bacterial disease. And I was thinking long ago, is there anything physics can tell us to try and stop this problem? So we thought very much in terms of reducing surgical site infections in hospitals by killing drug-resistant bacteria, but again with the same idea that it's going to be safe for human exposure. So the first few years we thought about it and we worked on really entirely on bacteria. And then 2 or 3 years after that, the penny dropped that actually we could use this for viruses too. Viruses are also very, very small like bacteria. And there was no COVID-19 at that point. So we were particularly thinking about influenza. We should never forget that influenza is a very, very nasty virus which kills a lot of people every year and no doubt will continue to do so. So what we were looking at far UVC light for was to essentially try and limit the seasonal influenza epidemic that we have every year, which kills an awful lot of people every year. So we've been slowly working the last 3 or 4 years really in the influenza world. So then come the beginning of this year and COVID-19 appears, then it became immediately apparent to us that the ideas that we'd have for influenza were going to be applicable to COVID-19, because again, it's transmitted from person to person, primarily in the influenza case by airborne routes. So all the concepts that we developed for influenza seem to be applicable to the COVID-19 crisis. So the first thing we started to do was do some measurements. Can the far UVC light kill coronaviruses in the air? And the answer, which we've actually just published very recently, is yes. We certainly expected that it would kill coronaviruses, and it does.
Great news, and I think we should get these into hospitals stat. That seems like the first great application and has many co-benefits. But I know we're running out of time, so let's try to get in one more audience question before we have to wrap up. So, from Stephen Petronic, we live in a symbiotic relationship with bacteria, many of which are essential to life. Would this create such a sterile environment that it would ultimately be harmful to us?
Yeah, well, that's a really good question, because it's undoubtedly that there are bad bacteria, which I was just talking about, like MRSA, but there are good bugs too, and they are essential for us. So most of the microbiome that help us are inside our bodies, or inside our gut, for example, and that's not going to be an issue because UVC light simply can't reach into the gut. It can't penetrate into the body, as we talked about. There is a skin microbiome actually on the very surface of our skin, and that's something that we think about a lot. But if you think about it, how many times have you washed today? Many. So that is going to be more damaging to the skin microbiome than far UVC light will be. So what we know of the skin microbiome, by definition, it's really tough. It can resist a lot, and even when it's removed, it comes back pretty quickly. So we don't think that the skin microbiome is going to be a significant issue. Certainly, just as long as we keep washing, there's going to be more damage to the skin microbiome than there's going to be from far UVC light.
And that's why we keep washing our hands, even once these far UVC lights become available. So I think we have time for one final audience question. Let's see if we can sneak it in. From Terry Moore, what problems need to be solved to make this technology happen now? How can the TED community help?
Well, that's a very good question from a TED friend. And I think the biggest problem that needs to be solved now, and we've alluded to it in our conversation, is building up the capacity for these lamps. Industry really only started building these lamps in the spring, so the capacity really isn't there for the millions of lamps that there is a demand for right now. So there are a few aspects to that. One is, well, it would be really nice if there was a simpler, cheaper technology for producing these lamps. The lamps are not particularly expensive and they're not particularly complicated, but if it could be made much cheaper and much simpler to manufacture, and I'm thinking perhaps particularly about the LED, just in the same way as LEDs slowly are replacing conventional light bulbs, LEDs have the potential for replacing the current type of UVC light. Would be quicker, would be easier to make, probably cheaper, probably longer lived. So the science community, I think, could certainly be putting a little more attention, but I'm certainly thinking about it, to different technologies to make the far UVC production capacity happen faster and happen cheaper. So yeah, that's a little call to the optics community around us. Let's develop some LED lights at these far UVC wavelengths.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, David, for joining us and sharing this ray of hope in these pandemic times. Thank you so much.
It's been a real pleasure. Thank you.